Stand for a moment in a small village churchyard somewhere in the hills of the Central Balkans, the air thick with the scent of dry grass and wild thyme. The gravestones around you are carved with names and dates, marking generations of families who insist they have always been here, rooted to this exact patch of stony soil since before anyone can remember. Now imagine that a team of scientists gently opens one of those graves, not a recent one, but a burial from the time when the Roman Empire was beginning to fray at the edges. They extract a tiny fragment of bone, sequence the DNA preserved inside, and place that ancient genome next to yours, the living descendant standing in the churchyard. What they find shatters the simple story. The person in the grave is not your direct ancestor in the way your family tree claims. In fact, the majority of the genetic makeup flowing in your veins today arrived in this region more recently than the fall of Rome, carried by people who were not speaking your language, not practicing your customs, and not even buried in the same manner as the older skeletons beneath your feet. The Balkan Peninsula, a sun-scorched and mountain-folded bridge between continents, holds one of the most tangled genetic stories ever uncovered. A story where more than half of the ancestry of entire modern nations comes from a migration that began barely 15 centuries ago. Today, we walk through a single, landmark ancient DNA investigation that has rewritten what we know about identity, empire, and belonging in southeastern Europe. And we will follow the evidence from imperial marble streets to the faint chemical signatures locked inside 700-year-old teeth. By the time the last thread pulls tight, you will see every family story, every national history, and even your own reflection in a fundamentally different light, because what happened here reveals a hidden rule about how human populations actually change. Stay until the final minute, because the deepest revelation is not about who arrived, but about who never left a trace at all. The narrow, testable question at the heart of this story sounds deceptively simple. Who are the modern people of the Balkans descended from, in a direct biological sense, and when did the major chunks of their ancestry actually arrive? This is not a question about culture, language, or chosen identity. It is a question written in the four-letter code of DNA, and until very recently, it was impossible to answer with precision. For decades, historians and archaeologists could describe the movements of armies, the spread of pottery styles, and the adoption of new words, but they could not see the actual movements of bodies and bloodlines. The Roman Empire dominated this peninsula for centuries, stationing legions from Italy, building roads, imposing laws, and extracting taxes. The textbooks tell a story of thorough Romanization. Later, the story goes, Slavic-speaking tribes swept down from the north during the chaotic centuries of the early Middle Ages. But did the Romans leave a deep genetic imprint, a permanent stamp of Italian ancestry on the Balkan population? And did the Slavs completely replace the people who lived there before? Or did they simply mix into a resilient local substrate? A groundbreaking study published in December 2023 in the journal Cell, led by researchers including Iosif Lazaridis and the group of David Reich at Harvard Medical School in collaboration with Balkan archaeologists, finally cracked open this black box. They analyzed the genomes of individuals who lived across the region between roughly the year 1 and 1000 CE, stitching together a 1,000-year genetic movie. And buried inside that movie is one specific, startling find that pays off only at the very end of this journey. A find that reveals a ghost population that history completely forgot to write down. That ghost changes what the word indigenous actually means here. Before we step into what the DNA revealed, we need to clear away the stories that people have been telling themselves for generations. Stories that feel true, but collapse under the weight of hard evidence. The first and most emotionally powerful assumption is that each modern Balkan nation descends in a clean, unbroken, and distinct line from a single ancient tribal ancestor. In this view, modern Croatians, or Serbs, are the direct biological continuation of early Slavs who arrived in the 6th or 7th century, while modern Albanians are the pure descendants of the Illyrians, an Iron Age people who inhabited the Western Balkans long before Rome arrived. This idea of a singular, enduring bloodline is the bedrock of many national histories. The DNA, however, refuses to draw such clean lines. The genetic data shows that all modern Balkan populations are deep mixtures, and the ingredients overlap across national borders in ways that national histories cannot easily digest. A Serb, a Bosnian, a Croatian, and a Romanian from the same geographic pocket often share the same 3 or 4 deep ancestral components, just in subtly different percentages. The idea of a pure, unbroken line extending from one ancient tribe to one modern nation is a powerful story, but it is a story, not a genetic fact. A second popular assumption concerns the Roman Empire itself. Because Roman rule lasted for centuries, because Latin was the language of power, and because the empire was centered in Italy, it seems natural to assume that large numbers of Italian Romans must have settled in the Balkans, intermarried, and left a major genetic signature. You can picture retired legionaries from Campania or Latium receiving land grants in what is now Serbia or Bulgaria, raising families, and permanently Italianizing the local gene pool. This assumption feels so obvious that it was rarely questioned. The ancient DNA results deliver a genuine shock here. Despite the overwhelming cultural, military, and political dominance of Rome, the study found no significant genetic evidence of Iron Age Italian ancestry spreading into the Balkan population during the imperial period. The roads and aqueducts remain, the Latin inscriptions still stand, but the Italian bloodlines did not flow eastward in any demographically meaningful way. Political conquest is one thing, biological replacement is an entirely different creature. A third assumption is that the great migrations of the early Middle Ages were relatively shallow events, where small warrior elites imposed their language and rule on a much larger, stable local population who simply learned to speak Slavic. This is a common pattern in world history, a thin aristocratic layer changing the culture while the mass of peasants stays the same. The genetic data from the Balkans, however, points to something far more profound. The arrival of populations genetically similar to today's Slavic-speaking Eastern Europeans starting around the 6th century CE was not a thin elite overlay. It was one of the largest permanent demographic shifts anywhere in Europe during the era of the Great Migrations. The numbers are not subtle. Slavic-related ancestry now makes up roughly 30 to 60% of the ancestry of modern Balkan populations overall. This is not a sprinkle of foreign elite DNA. This is a deep, population-level replacement that touched nearly every corner of the peninsula, from the Danube to the Peloponnese. The real picture begins to come into focus when you look at the actual study that produced these revelations. The research, published in Cell in late 2023, under the title, A Genetic History of the Balkans from Roman Frontier to Slavic Migrations, was a monumental logistical and scientific effort. The team, anchored by the Harvard Ancient DNA Laboratory, led by David Reich and including key researcher Iosif Lazaridis, worked with a network of archaeologists and museums across the Balkan region. They did not sample one or two famous graves. They assembled a database of genomes from individuals who lived between approximately the 1st century and the 10th century CE, a span of 1,000 years that captures the region before, during, and after the collapse of Roman authority. The scale is what gives the study its power. They analyzed whole genome data from a large set of ancient individuals, a sample size large enough to track subtle shifts in ancestry proportions over time and across geography. The method itself is a marvel of plain language science. From a tiny drilled powder of petrous bone, the densest part of the skull, they extracted fragments of DNA, sequenced them, and compared millions of single-letter genetic variants against a vast reference panel of modern and ancient populations. This lets them calculate, with real statistical confidence, how much of an individual's ancestry came from a gene pool resembling ancient Anatolians, how much from Iron Age Italians, how much from Northeastern Europeans, and how much from the pre-existing local Balkan Iron Age populations. The question had stayed unsolved for so long because written records from the migration period are scarce and famously biased, and because modern populations had been so shuffled by 20th century movements that living DNA alone could not reconstruct the deep past. The ancient bones were the only honest witnesses. The researchers themselves expressed a kind of humbled surprise at the clarity of the signals. Patterns they expected to be fuzzy and ambiguous snapped into sharp focus, and one of the lead authors noted that the disconnect between the cultural narrative of Romanization and the biological reality was one of the most striking disconnects they had ever seen. The Roman Empire, for all its historical weight, was a genetic ghost here, and that sets the stage for the first of 6 escalating reveals. The first chapter takes us to the deepest layer, the pre-Roman Iron Age substrate. Before the legions marched east, before the Slavic migrations, the Balkans were home to societies that Greek and Roman writers later called Illyrians, Thracians, and Dacians. The genetic profile of these Iron Age Balkan people forms the baseline of our story. When the researchers sequenced individuals from this period, they found a population that was itself already a complex mix of earlier European farmers and steppe pastoralists who had arrived in the Bronze Age. But the key is that they formed a coherent, localized gene pool by the time the Romans appeared. You can picture a Thracian settlement in what is now Bulgaria, a cluster of wooden longhouses on a river terrace, the air hazy with smoke from pottery kilns, a woman grinding emmer wheat on a saddle quern, while her child plays with a clay figurine of a horse. That child's genetic signature, if we could read it, would anchor one end of a long chain. The surprising side fact here is that this Iron Age substrate did not vanish. It persists in modern Balkan populations, as a minority but significant component, a base layer that later waves flowed over and mixed into. On one side, this local Iron Age ancestry forms roughly 20 to 40% of the genome of some modern groups in the region. On the other side, the incoming components we will discuss in later chapters account for the larger share. The comparison is stark. The deep indigenous ancestry is real and detectable, but it is not the dominant fraction. It is a submerged foundation, not the visible walls of the house. This finding immediately complicates any simple narrative of continuity, and it sets up a critical question. If the Iron Age locals did not simply continue to dominate the peninsula, what happened when the Roman Empire arrived? That question leads us into the second chapter. The second chapter confronts the Roman imperial period directly, and the evidence here is so counterintuitive that it requires a complete mental reset. Between roughly the 1st and 5th centuries CE, the Balkans were integrated into the Roman imperial system. Soldiers from across the empire were stationed along the Danube frontier. Cities like Sirmium, Singidunum, and Thessalonica flourished with forums, baths, and amphitheaters. Latin became the language of administration and trade in the interior. The cultural transformation was immense, and yet, when the researchers analyzed the genomes of individuals buried in Roman-era Balkan contexts, they found a dramatic influx of ancestry, but it was not coming from Italy. Instead, the new ancestry was overwhelmingly Anatolian, from the region of modern-day Turkey. This was the true demographic signature of the Roman Empire in the Balkans. Microcene, a stonemason in 3rd century Nasus, modern niche in Serbia, chisels a Latin dedication to a local official. His tunic is Roman in style, his tools are Roman, his language is Latin, and his children play with Roman-style glass marbles. When he dies, he is buried with a coin in his mouth, according to Roman rite. Yet his genome, if we tested it today, would trace back not to Rome or Milan, but to a village in Phrygia, or Cappadocia, in Anatolia. The numbers are telling. In some urban sites from the Roman period, Anatolian-related ancestry spikes to roughly 40 to 50% of the local population's gene pool, while Italian-related ancestry remains statistically indistinguishable from zero. On the other side of the empire, Italy was exporting its administrative and military structures, but not its people in large numbers. The Roman Empire moved populations from the east to the north, from the cities of Asia Minor to the frontier zones of Europe, on a scale that history books had only hinted at. This is the hidden mobility of empire, where the capital's genetic shadow was cast not by Italians, but by peoples from the eastern provinces. This revelation dismantles the Roman myth in the Balkans, but it also prepares us for an even larger disruption, because the Anatolian influx was about to be swamped by a wave from the complete opposite direction. The third chapter shifts our gaze to the 6th century CE, when the demographic engine of the Balkans underwent its most violent and permanent transformation. The fall of the Western Roman Empire created a vacuum, and into that vacuum moved populations that geneticists describe as being most similar to modern Slavic-speaking Eastern Europeans. This was not a single organized invasion, but a sustained, multi-century movement of families, not just warriors. The genetic signature of this migration is so strong that it forms the single largest component in most modern Balkan populations today. A microcene brings it to life. Imagine a small river valley in what is now Croatia on a damp autumn evening in the early 7th century. A group of migrants has built sunken-floored huts, their roofs thatched with reeds from the stream. A woman tends a clay oven dug into the earth floor, baking flatbreads from rye flour. Her pottery is simple, handmade, and very different from the wheel-thrown Roman wares still used by the surviving town dwellers a few valleys over. Her infant, slung in a linen wrap, carries a genome that will, in a few generations, blend with the Anatolian-descended urbanites and the residual Iron Age locals to form a new genetic average. The surprising side fact is the sheer scale. This Slavic-related ancestry now makes up roughly 30 to 60% of modern Balkan genomes overall. The two-sided number comparison is crucial. In present-day Serbia, the proportion sits at roughly 50 to 60% of total ancestry. In mainland Greece, it drops to roughly 30 to 40%. In some Aegean islands, it falls as low as roughly 20%. This is a clear geographic gradient, a north-to-south cline that physically maps the path of the migration. The forward tease is this: despite this massive genetic shift, the languages and identities we see today do not align perfectly with this ancestry, and that misalignment is the subject of the next chapter. The fourth chapter reveals the profound mismatch between genetic ancestry and modern linguistic identity. One of the most startling findings of the ancient DNA study is that the Slavic-related genetic component is detectable even in present-day populations and regions where Slavic languages are not spoken today. This includes Romania, where a Romance language derived from Latin survives, and Greece, where the Greek language has deep continuous roots. You can stand in a village in the Peloponnese, listening to a grandmother speak a dialect of Greek that preserves words Homer would recognize. And yet a significant fraction of her genome traces back to those 7th century migrants who arrived speaking an entirely different language family. The microscene is a sensory paradox. Picture a whitewashed church on a Greek island, the air smelling of incense and beeswax, a liturgy chanted in Koine Greek that has echoed through these stone walls for centuries. The congregation's faces are illuminated by candlelight, and their genetic inheritance is a mosaic where the Slavic migration is visibly present in the DNA, but invisible in the language they pray in. The numbers sharpen the contrast. In some regions of mainland Greece, Slavic-related ancestry reaches roughly 40%. On the other side, the Aegean Islands can show as little as roughly 20%, and yet both regions are unambiguously Greek-speaking today. Similarly, in Romania, the persistence of a Romance language alongside a substantial Slavic-related genetic component, which can approach roughly 40 to 50% in some areas, shows that language and genes can follow completely different historical paths. Language can be a matter of cultural inheritance and prestige, while genes are a silent, impartial record of who actually met whom in the dark of the early medieval centuries. This disconnect is not a denial of identity, but a deeper truth. The genetic ancestry pattern simply does not line up neatly with today's national or linguistic boundaries. This leads us to a further, more politically charged layer: the question of how this ancestry is shared across groups that today see themselves as distinct. The fifth chapter exposes the shared ancestry among modern groups that are often framed as deeply separate. The ancient DNA evidence shows that the same 3 or 4 ancestral components, the Iron Age Balkan, the Anatolian, the Slavic-related, and a minor Eastern steppe signal, appear in broadly similar proportions in Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, Romanians, and mainland Greeks, with the specific percentages shifting along geographic gradients rather than along modern national borders. A Serbian and a Bosnian from villages on opposite sides of a river share more genetic history with each other than either does with a co-national living 500 kilometers away. The microscene is a border market. Imagine a dusty crossing point between 2 Balkan states in the early 20th century, 2 farmers haggling over the price of a lamb. One is Orthodox, the other Catholic. Their last names mark them as different nations. Their great-grandparents spoke dialects that were mutually intelligible. The genomes they carry are so close that a geneticist without labels would place them as siblings in the same regional cluster. The surprising side fact is that the Slavic-related component, which is often claimed exclusively by Slavic-speaking nations as their own unique heritage, is equally present in populations that do not identify as Slavic at all. It is a regional inheritance, not an ethnic badge. The two-sided number comparison drives this home. In northern Croatia, the Slavic-related ancestry sits at roughly 50 to 60%. In northern Serbia, the number is nearly identical. In the contiguous border regions, the genetic transition is smooth, not abrupt. The hard cultural and political lines drawn on maps today are invisible to the DNA. This shared genetic fabric raises a deeply uncomfortable question for any narrative that insists on ancient, exclusive ownership of territory, and it points directly to a final reveal about the true nature of the Iron Age substrate that both groups claim as distinct. The sixth and final chapter of Reveals confronts the Iron Age substrate directly. The Illyrians, Thracians, and Dacians, who are so often claimed as exclusive ancestors by individual modern nations. The ancient DNA study confirms that this pre-Roman, pre-Slavic layer is real, but it is not split into neat, non-overlapping tribes that correspond to modern countries. The Iron Age populations of the Balkans were already genetically similar to each other, forming a broad continuum across the peninsula. A person buried in an Illyrian tumulus near the Adriatic coast, and a person buried in a Thracian grave in inland Bulgaria were not genetically identical, but they were branches of a related local tree. The microscene is a highland pasture. Picture a summer evening in the Dinaric Alps during the 3rd century BCE, a young shepherd playing a bone flute, his flock spread across the limestone karst. He belongs to a group that Greek writers would call Illyrians. 300 kilometers east, another shepherd watches the sunset over the lower Danube plain, part of a network the same writers label Thracian. Their genomes, if we could compare them, would show a shared deep ancestry with subtle regional flavorings, not a sharp racial divide. The surprising side fact is that this Iron Age component is not the dominant ancestry in any modern Balkan population. It is a minority fraction, roughly 20 to 40%, that has been swamped first by Anatolian gene flow during the Roman period, and then overwhelmingly by the Slavic-related migrations. The two-sided comparison is essential here. The Iron Age ancestry makes up perhaps 30% of a modern mainland Greek genome. On the other side, the Slavic-related component makes up roughly 40%. The older layer is real, but it is not the majority story. This forces a difficult recognition. The people who are most often invoked as the pure, original ancestors are, in genetic terms, a submerged substrate. The forward tease is over, and the evidence now visibly converges toward a single, unavoidable conclusion. All the threads now pull tight. The Anatolian pulse under the Roman Empire, the massive Slavic-era demographic wave, the persistent but minority Iron Age substrate, and the stark absence of Italian ancestry despite centuries of Roman rule. All these signals point in one direction. The genetic history of the Balkans is a story of repeated, large-scale replacement and blending, not a story of continuous, isolated descent. The core answer is this. The modern populations of the Balkans are not primarily the direct, unbroken biological descendants of the Iron Age tribes that classical writers called Illyrians, Thracians, and Dacians. Instead, the majority of their ancestry comes from two massive, relatively recent migration events. First, a huge influx of people from Anatolia during the height of the Roman Empire. Second, and even more significantly, a wave of migration by people genetically similar to modern Eastern Slavs starting around the 6th century CE, which now accounts for roughly 30 to 60% of the ancestry across the peninsula. The Iron Age locals did not vanish, but their genetic contribution is now a minority component. The Roman Empire, for all its overwhelming cultural presence, left a genetic legacy not from Italy, but from Anatolia. The Slavic migration was not a shallow elite takeover, but a deep demographic transformation that reshaped the biological landscape of the entire region. But this core answer, as blunt as it is not the end of the story. There is a twist that reframes what the word ancestry even means in the context of this land. The twist is this. The group that did not leave a major genetic trace, the Iron Age Italians, actually had a far more lasting biological impact on the Balkans through a completely different, indirect route. The Anatolian gene flow that flooded the Balkans during the Roman period was itself a product of the Roman Empire, a massive, state-driven redistribution of human beings from the densely populated eastern provinces to the frontier zones. The empire acted as a gigantic pump, moving Anatolian farmers, artisans, and soldiers into the Balkan interior. This means that the Roman Empire did reshape the Balkan gene pool profoundly, but it did so using people from its eastern territories, not its Italian core. The political and cultural system was centered in Rome, but the demographic consequences were sourced from Ephesus, Ancyra, and Nicomedia. The historical irony is sharp. Modern nationalist narratives in the Balkans often minimize the Roman and Slavic periods as foreign interruptions of an indigenous continuity, and they equally often look to the pre-Roman Iron Age as the golden age of pure national origins. The DNA reveals a double subversion. The Roman interruption was deeply transformative genetically, but it was an Anatolian, not Italian transformation. And the Iron Age pure origin layer is, in genetic terms, a minority substrate that was substantially reshaped long before the Slavs arrived. The Slavic migration then added a new layer that is now the single largest component, a layer that is shared across groups that today draw hard lines between each other. The mechanism of this reframing is the difference between cultural and biological inheritance. A Roman road, a Latin inscription, a legal code, these can persist and shape identity without a single Italian gene being present. A Slavic language can vanish from a region, while the genes of its original speakers remain in the mouths of people now chanting Greek Orthodox liturgies. The unexpected comparison is to a palimpsest, a medieval manuscript where the original text is scraped off and a new text is written over it. The old text never fully disappears. It haunts the page, faintly visible under ultraviolet light, just as the Iron Age and Anatolian components still lurk under the bright ink of the Slavic migration. The takeaway is that identity is real, but it is a cultural construction layered over a biological reality that is far messier, more shared, and more recently arrived than any nationalist story can comfortably admit. This conclusion does not rest on a single study. An entirely independent category of evidence from medical genetics and linguistics converges on the same pattern. Medical geneticists have long noticed that certain inherited disease variants and pharmacogenetic markers show frequency declines across the Balkans that ignore national borders. For example, specific mutations linked to cystic fibrosis or familial Mediterranean fever are found at frequencies that map onto the same north to south gradient described in the ancient DNA paper. A gradient shaped not by modern political boundaries, but by the path of the Slavic migrations and the earlier Anatolian influx. The distribution of these disease variants cannot be explained by recent cultural choices. They are the living, medical echo of the medieval demographic wave. In parallel, the field of historical linguistics has independently reconstructed a deep layer of shared vocabulary and grammatical features across the Balkan languages, the so-called Balkan Sprachbund, that suggests intense, prolonged bilingualism and contact. Albanian, Romanian, Bulgarian, Macedonian, and Greek share structural features like the merging of the genitive and dative cases, or the formation of the future tense with a particle meaning to want. This linguistic convergence implies that speakers of different languages lived cheek by jowl, intermarrying and blending their ways of speaking, for centuries after the migrations. The genetic mixing and the linguistic mixing are two faces of the same coin, a daily reality of human contact that the written chronicles, focused on kings and battles, entirely ignored. A second, unrelated genetic study focusing on Y chromosome lineages in the Balkans, published in a separate journal, found that certain male lineages associated with the Slavic expansion, such as specific subclades of haplogroup R1a, show the same north-to-south frequency gradient, with peaks in Slovenia and Croatia and declining frequencies toward southern Greece. The convergence of whole genome ancient DNA, modern medical allele frequencies, linguistic typology, and uniparental markers is a powerful independent confirmation. Disparate fields, asking different questions with different tools, are all pointing to the same deep story of shared, recent ancestry. How did this biological mechanism actually work on the ground? The deep dive into the mechanism requires us to hold two seemingly opposed facts in our minds at once. The Slavic-related migration was massive, yet it did not result in a total population replacement. The mechanism was a sustained, multi-generational process of demic diffusion, where moving families, not just roving war bands, settled in small, fertile pockets across the landscape. The hard comparative numbers tell the story of costs and benefits. On one side, the arriving migrants carried a biological advantage in certain environments. Their gene pool was adapted to the cooler, wetter climates of northeastern Europe, and they brought with them a subsistence package that included hardy rye, oats, and a pastoral system well-suited to the forested uplands of the Dinaric Alps. Their high-frequency lactase persistence alleles, the genetic variants that allow adults to digest milk, gave them a caloric advantage. The frequency of lactase persistence in the incoming Slavic-related population was roughly 40 to 60%, a massive metabolic edge over the pre-existing Balkan populations, where the trait was likely much rarer, perhaps below 20%. On the other side, the established Anatolian-descended and Iron Age populations held the advantages of urban infrastructure, trade networks, and immunity to local endemic diseases like malaria, which was hyper-endemic in the marshy coastal plains. The mechanism was not a clean conquest. It was a patchwork of settlement, disease, differential birth rates, and intermarriage over 3 centuries. A Slavic-related family might clear a patch of oak forest and prosper, their children surviving at a higher rate because of milk consumption during winter famines. An urban Greek-speaking family in Thessalonica might lose 3 children out of 4 to malaria, while their 4th child marries a Slavic-speaking trader and raises bilingual children. Over 10 generations, a roughly 300-year span from the 7th to the 10th centuries, these small, incremental advantages compounded into a wholesale genetic shift. The cost was the erosion of the previous genetic landscape, a loss of Iron Age diversity that we can never fully recover. The benefit was the creation of a new, highly diverse gene pool that combined the immune strengths of multiple source populations, a biological resilience that may have helped the region survive later epidemics. It is essential to state clearly what this evidence does and does not prove. The ancient DNA study published in Cell provides robust, peer-reviewed evidence for large-scale demographic shifts in the Balkans between the 1st and 10th centuries CE. The percentage figures are study-reported estimates with real margins of error, so we treat all numbers as rough approximations, not exact fixed values. The study does not prove that every village experienced a uniform influx. There were likely pockets of refuge where older genetic patterns persisted longer, particularly in high mountain valleys or on remote islands, a pattern that the lower Slavic-related ancestry in some Aegean islands hints at. The evidence does not support any claim of complete population replacement. The older layers are still there, just reduced. Furthermore, the study cannot directly tell us what language any individual spoke, what identity they claimed, or what stories they told their children around the fire. Those are inferential leaps, not direct genetic facts. Some claims made in popular discussion, particularly those that tie modern nations directly and exclusively to one ancient migration wave, are not supported by these data and are often rooted in political ideologies, not science. The genetic story is a story of blending and shared ancestry, not a story of purity or exclusive descent. This history is not locked away in dusty journals. It lives in your body, in your family, in the way you think about who you are. If you have roots anywhere in the Balkan Peninsula, from the Julian Alps to the southern Peloponnese, from the Black Sea coast to the Adriatic Islands, the specific, dramatic migrations we have traced here are a chapter in your personal biography. You carry the Anatolian farmer who moved west under the Roman eagle. You carry the Iron Age shepherd who saw Homer's dawns. You carry the Slavic-speaking migrant who built a sunken hut in a virgin forest and mixed her blood with the locals. These ancestors are all inside you, not layered like a neat cake, but blended like a single swirling liquid. Think of the Roman-era Anatolian pulse, invisible in the history books but loud in your genome. Think of the missing Italian centurion, a ghost who left laws and roads but no DNA. Think of the massive Slavic wave, the single largest component, shared across borders that people kill for. Think of the submerged Iron Age Illyrian and Thracian substrate, the faint base layer that is real but no longer dominant. Think of the medical alleles that follow the migration gradient, still influencing your health today. And finally, think of the master loop we opened at the very beginning, the ghost population that history forgot. That ghost is the Anatolian Roman. For centuries, historians told the story of the Roman Balkans as a story of Latinization from Italy. The DNA reveals that the true biological legacy of the Roman Empire in southeastern Europe was a massive displacement of people from Asia Minor, a forgotten tide that silently reshaped the peninsula's genetic destiny before the Slavs ever arrived. The empire's most permanent monument in the Balkans was not a temple or a road. It was the hidden Anatolian ancestry flowing in the veins of its people. The title's meaning echoes through this entire story, not as a literal quote, but as a recognition that the deeper we dig, the more the simple tales of pure origins dissolve into a shared, complicated, and endlessly surprising human tapestry. If you could sit down with all of these ancestors at one table, what language would you speak to them? And what would they think of the names and borders you now call home? Tell us in the comments.